Good morning, all of you. This is time that we discuss William Shakespeare. Shakespeare seems to be the greatest of English playwrights and poets, the world's greatest poet and playwright. And so there are plays of Shakespeare prescribed in all the universities, all over the world, from California to Calcutta. The plays of Shakespeare are prescribed for study in almost all the universities all over the world. And the importance of Shakespeare is such that we are supposed to expect a few questions for the UGC also from Shakespeare. And Shakespeare has got 36 plays plus 154 sonnets and a few independent poems also. So there are people who say that Shakespeare has got 37 plays. But in the first folio and second folio, the number is given as 36. And Dr. Johnson, we know, is the great editor of Shakespeare. And he took into consideration only the 36 plays. And at a later stage, two professors named Delvecchio and Hammond, they included one more play in the canon of Shakespeare and made it 37. And the one play added by them was Pericles, the Prince of Tyre. And it was the 37th play added in the canon of Shakespeare by Delvecchio and Hammond, two professors of university. But in the first folio and second folio, we come to find that there are only 36 plays. And Dr. Johnson and the other editors followed the first folio and the second folio. The first folio was produced in 1623 and the second folio was produced in 1632. And when 23 is to be put in the reverse order, it is 32. And seemingly very easy for us to remember the dates. First folio in the year 1623, second folio in the year 1632. And when we go into the biographical details of Shakespeare, there are a lot of ambiguities. Shakespeare was born on 23rd April 1564. And we know that Queen Elizabeth came to power in 1558. And when Shakespeare was born in 1564, Elizabeth had completed 6 years of her rule. And Queen Elizabeth was the Tudor monarch then. And Shakespeare was born on 23rd April. Very interestingly, the date of birth and the date of death are the same as far as Shakespeare is concerned. He was born on 23rd April 1564 and died on 23rd April 1616 at the age of 52. Shakespeare had only a short life. He died when he was only 52 years. And very interestingly, Christopher Marlowe, another important poet of the period, was also born in the same year, 1564. Shakespeare and Marlowe were born in the same year. But Marlowe was born in February and Shakespeare was born in April. And Shakespeare's father was John Shakespeare and he was a merchant dealing with leather goods. And his mother was Mary Arden. And the place where Shakespeare was born was Stratford upon Avon. And it is this reason why we colloquially call Shakespeare as the Bard of Avon. And the place of birth was Stratford upon Avon. And Shakespeare's father was a well-to-do merchant and mother was a housemaker. And at the time of Shakespeare, there was only a grammar school in the place. And Shakespeare might have attended the grammar school, and we are not sure about it. And Shakespeare has got only very limited basic education. So we believe that Shakespeare might have attended the grammar school there. And at the age of 18, Shakespeare got married with a girl who was 8 years elder to him. Shakespeare was only 18, and his wife Anna Hathaway was 26 years then. And she had also another child. And within 6 months after the marriage, she delivered the first child of Shakespeare. Shakespeare was having illicit relation with her and got married with Anna Hathaway. And a few years later, Shakespeare left Stratford and reached London. And there are many stories connected with his leaving the place. So it was believed that he escaped from prosecution by a man named Sir Thomas Lilly, a magistrate in the place, for some kind of deer poaching that Shakespeare tried to disturb the deer left in the park there. And for that a case was filed against Shakespeare, and Shakespeare escaped from Stratford from the prosecution ordered by Sir Thomas Lilly. And Shakespeare reached London. And he came to be associated with the theatre there as a stable keeper. Started as a stable keeper, working in the stable of the theatre. And the theatrical people then used to ride on their horses to reach the place of action. And Shakespeare assisted as a stable keeper. And later he turned to become an actor. In some situation, when there were the absence of actors, Shakespeare performed the roles. And later turned to become a playwright. And by 1592, Shakespeare had established himself as a playwright. Very interestingly, in 1592, Shakespeare had established himself as a famous playwright. And why we refer to the year 1592 as the year that Shakespeare had become famous? Because it was in that year Robert Greene produced a book called A Groat's Worth of Wit, bought with $1 million of repentance. The title is slightly long. A Groat's Worth of Wit, bought with $1 million of repentance, was a book written by Robert Greene in 1592. And in that book, Robert Greene refers to Shakespeare as an upstart crow, beautified with our feathers, that with his tiger's heart wrapped in a player's hide, an absolute Johannes factotum, that he was jack of all and master of none. Robert Greene was a prominent writer of the period, and he had written a book called A Groat's Worth of Wit, bought with $1 million of repentance in the year 1592. It was his deathbed diary. And Greene died in the same year. And it actually spoke about his own life. Autobiographical elements are there. And the protagonist is called Robert II. Robert II is actually Robert Greene. Robert II. And in the story we come to find that he has got his brother Lucanio. So it was written as a deathbed diary, and the story is the story of Robert Greene. And the protagonist there is Robert II, and he has got a brother named Lucanio. And when the father died, the whole property was given to Lucanio, and Robert was given only a groat, a small silver coin. Groat. And with that groat, with that silver coin in his pocket, Robert went to London and wrote plays pamphlets and established himself as a writer and made money. And by the time his brother Lucanio spoilt all his money spending on a mistress named Lemilia. And he lost all his money, and Roberto returned home and helped his brother. And it is the story described in A Groat's Worth of Witch. And in the same book there are references made to Shakespeare. And when Roberto speaks about his experiences in London, he says that there has been a threat nowadays in London by a man who is like an upstart crow, and he appears like a shake scene there. And by the reference to shake scene, we mean it is Shakespeare. And Shakespeare is referred to as a crow, upstart crow, beautified with the feathers of the players, and has got a tiger's heart, and is a Johannes factotum, jack of all and master of none. And very interestingly, in the Groatsworth of Witch, there are references to Christopher Marlowe also. And Christopher Marlowe is referred to as the atheist. And there is also reference to Thomas Nash. Nash has been referred to as the jailbait. And Shakespeare is referred to as a man with his own conceit, thinking that he is the only sheikh seen in the country. And remember that these are the references made by Robert Greene in his book, and the book was produced in 1592. And it is this reason why we say that Shakespeare became famous by the year 1592. And Shakespeare, I told you, produced 36 plays. There were 16 comedies, 10 tragedies, and 10 histories. And later one more play was added in the canon of Shakespeare by Delvecchio and Hammond, and it was called Pericles, the Prince of Tyre. And Shakespeare is also popular for his sonnet sequence, that there are 154 sonnets. The first 1 to 126 sonnets are addressed to a fair youth, and 127 to 154 are addressed to a dark lady. And Shakespeare had his patron, Earl of Southampton. And with the financial assistance of Southampton, Shakespeare was able to become partner of Globe Theatre. They started a theatre called the Globe Theatre. And The Tempest is believed to be the last play written by Shakespeare. And there are people who say that the last play written by him was King Henry's Age. And there are also people who say that the last play written by Shakespeare was The Noble Kinsman. The play he jointly wrote with Fletcher. And Shakespeare is said to have retired to Stratford in his final years. And he stayed in a very big house there, built by orders of Queen Elizabeth, called New Place. And his death came in 1616. And in the beginning I told you, Shakespeare was born on 23rd April 1564 and died on 23rd April 1616. And it is said that Shakespeare joined with Ben Jonson and Michael Drayton for a drinking bout. And Shakespeare was caught by some disease and he became dead in 1616. And there are a lot of ambiguities connected with the life and the literary works of Shakespeare. And during the lifetime of Shakespeare, quarto editions were published. The quarto was half the size of Folio. And mostly they were published without the consent of Shakespeare. And it was at the time, so the author enjoyed no copyright. And the collected works of Shakespeare's plays were published in 1623 by two of his fellow actors named Heminge and Contell. And this is the book known as the First Folio. and it was published in the year 1623. And the editors were two actors in his theatre called Heminch and Condell. And the systematic editing of Shakespeare's plays started only in the 18th century. And we come to find that there are many popular editors of Shakespeare like Alexander Pope and Dr. Johnson. And there are a lot of controversies connected with the authorship of the plays of Shakespeare. And there are scholars who argue that the so-called Shakespearean plays were written by someone else. And the reason is that Shakespeare was a man with little education, and he had never attended any university. And Ben Jonson, in his prefatory poem, attached it to the first folio, referred to Shakespeare as a man who knew little Latin and small Greek. And this reference is made by Ben Jonson in a prefatory poem put in the first folio. The reference is to Shakespeare knowing little Latin and small Greek. And we know that Shakespeare knew no Latin and Greek, and he knew only English, and he got ideas through the translations of the Latin and Greek books. And it is this reason why a man with practically no education had produced plays to be read all over the world and prescribed in most of the universities, made them think that the plays were written by somebody else. And the most important of these theories is the Baconian theory is the most prominent among them. And according to it, Sir Francis Bacon was the author of the plays of Shakespeare. And when we examine the theatres in the time of Shakespeare, we come to find that there were theatres like the Curtain, the Swan, the Globe, and the Blackfriars. And most of the theatres were open-air theatres, and the shows were conducted in the afternoon. And the first indoor theatre was the Blackfriars. And the two most important theatrical companies were the Admiral's Men, patronized by Marlowe, and the Chamberlain's Men, patronized by Shakespeare. Remember that Shakespeare's company was called Chamberlain's Men, and Marlowe's company was called Admiral's Men. And during the reign of King James, Lord Chamberlain's Men was renamed as King's Men. And James also was in good relation with Shakespeare, and he changed the name Lord Chamberlain's Men into King's Men. And the most important actor in Shakespeare's theatre was Richard Burbage. And it was Burbage who played the roles of the heroes in most of the plays. And there were also the very interesting actors like Robert Armin and William Kempe, and they were the comedians. And when we examine the source of Shakespeare, Shakespeare has got sources from various languages and various countries. And the history plays of Shakespeare, we know that there are 10 history plays produced by Shakespeare. And for the history plays, he borrowed sources from the Chronicles of Holinshed and Hall. So the Chronicles of Holinshed were used by him for his history plays. And he also used the Chronicles produced by Hall. And the Hall Chronicles are used for describing the Wars of the Roses. And for the other plays, he used the Chronicles of Holinshed. And remember, Marlowe also used the Chronicles of Holinshed for his history play, Edward II. And Shakespeare also borrowed from Holinshed and Hall. And for his Roman plays, there are a number of Roman plays like Julius Caesar, Antony Cleopatra, Coriolanus. And for these plays, Shakespeare used material from Plutarch's Lives translated by Thomas North. And for other tragedies, Shakespeare borrowed themes from various sources. So there are a number of Italian stories also in the canon of Shakespeare. And for the Italian plays, he borrowed material from Italian writers like Battello Mandello, translated by Bellaforest in French language, and again translated into English by William Painter and produced in a book called The Palace of Pleasure. For the Italian plays, we come to find the borrowing is from the Italian writers like Mattello Bandello. But Shakespeare didn't actually know any Italian, so he followed the translations. And the Italian was translated into French by Bellaforest. And Bellaforest was translated into English by William Painter. And Painter's book was called The Palace of Pleasure. And Shakespeare borrowed material from The Palace of Pleasure. And there are really very limited number of plays without any borrowing, like A Midsummer Night's Dream and The Merry Wives of Windsor. A few plays Shakespeare wrote from his own sources without borrowing. And actually, when we consider the date of composition of the plays of Shakespeare, there is no definite record of the date of Shakespeare plays. And we fix the date of Shakespeare plays based on three types of evidences. There are internal evidences, external evidences, and stylistic evidences. Internal evidences actually refer to a mention in the play about an incident, the date of which we happen to know. If there is some reference to a drought or a rainy season or a flood or some fire or some pestilence or diseases, so we come to identify the date, and we believe that those plays were written after these incidents, and this is what called the internal evidence. And we follow the external evidence also, and this is actually evidence has been given by some other writers. For example, there was a man named Francis Meres who produced a famous book called Palladistemia, and he produced the book in 1598, Palladistemia. Palladistemia is actually treasure house of wit, and he had made references to a dozen plays written by Shakespeare. He had made reference to 6 comedies and 6 tragedies written by Shakespeare, and we believe that these plays were written